to make sure that it picks up, and we'll do the same thing once I hit stop broadcast, just to make sure it catches the last bit of it, and then we can go ahead and start and start the conversation, and then obviously at the end wrap up the conversation. Sound great? All right. Here we go. So welcome back to Voices of Diversity. We're here with graduate student Angie, who wishes to remain anonymous. She is with the University of California system. And today we are talking about being undocumented as a graduate student, and specifically talking about DACA students, which is short for the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. Now, Angie, graduate school is obviously very, very challenging in and of itself. And this is significantly augmented when one is in graduate school. But these past few weeks especially have been incredibly challenging for DACA students and their loved ones. In terms of what's going on with the administration, and the fact that the renewal process, at least up until March, is no longer the same option that it was before. Can you speak a little bit about what these last few weeks have been like?
Yeah, I feel that, at least for me, in my experience, I am in counseling, so I know a lot about mental health and how anxiety affects everyone and all these things. And I am like midway through my graduate program, so I feel like part of me has disassociated to some degree with everything that's going on. I keep telling myself, I'm like, okay, I need to just get through this program. I was also in the education system before DACA was introduced. And so part of that has kind of helped me cope with the idea that, oh, I've done school without DACA. I've done it without the benefits that's come with it. So I could do it again should nothing really be introduced. By the time DACA ends, I am not able to renew my DACA because it doesn't end until the following year.
Wow.
So it's been more of planning. Like, I've made multiple plans. I have like lists of multiple outcomes. Like, okay, I am very privileged to have DACA, and I've been able to work, which has paid for my tuition and my health insurance. And now with the thought of DACA ending, I'm like, okay, if I don't have a job, how will I pay for tuition? Like, how will I pay for all these things? Will I move back home and live with my family to save money and I could finish my dissertation afar? So just things like that, like trying to plan of like, how will I finish this program in the next year? Because I definitely will not drop out of the program, but it will definitely make it a lot more difficult, at least financially. And, access to grant and finances and travel grants sometimes have stipulations of citizenship. So just knowing that my options will be more limited than what they are now is something that I consider, but also try to keep in the back of my head so that I can just get up in the morning and fulfill my graduate student duties.
Yeah, definitely. Sometimes it's a day by day, but I also hear in your voice just a great deal of ambition and motivation to keep moving forward. And one of the things you noted is that, well, you've been in school outside of DACA, right? I mean, you were able to attain an education, higher education, right? And being where you are has not been easy, obviously. And how can you speak a little bit in terms of your own networks of support? I know you mentioned your family, but also formal and other informal networks. I'm not sure how close your family is just geographically in terms of where you're studying now, but can you talk a little bit about that larger community that you have created?
Yeah, my family lives about 5-6 hours from where I am. And with graduate school, it's a little harder to, travel back and forth and stick to my obligations. So I have not been able to at least physically connect with them as much as I wanted to. And also this whole uncertainty, at least in my family, we tend to not talk about things right openly. And so we'll have small conversations here and there, but I know my parents trying to not to worry me, and then I try not to worry them. So yeah, they are supportive in other ways. I know they always say that the door is always open if I ever need to come back home, and that's something that I really appreciate. And in terms of being at the UC system, it's been an interesting experience. I went to a small private liberal arts college where I feel like there was a much greater network there for undocumented undergrad students at the time. And now that I'm in grad school, I've noticed that at least the network is a lot smaller, just because I've been the only grad student here who is undocumented, and it's only been within the last year that maybe one or two are added. So it's been isolating in that sense. I have friends who I've disclosed my status to, and they're supportive. My faculty advisor is supportive. We have an undocumented student coordinator for undergrads that I've talked to, and she's been supportive. But there is something missing with having other people who are kind of also going through this with you. I tend to contact my undergrad friends who are also in grad school and are undocumented, and so I've been able to find support in that way. And also with my partner, he's been very supportive through this process because he also shares a similar background as me.
So you've touched upon some of this question, or the question I'm about to ask you, but I was wondering maybe you could even elaborate too, in terms of what it means to be in graduate school as an undocumented student on a daily level. I mean, you did mention that you have good support. Some of it is virtual, right? I mean, obviously it's real, but we use virtual platforms to make those connections. And in the context of professors in the University of California system, but what does it mean on a daily level, right? To be able to go to class, right? To come back home, to the library, to the coffee shop, right? And I mean, this is part of one of our multiple identities, right? So what does it mean on a daily level?
Yeah. My first, I want to say 2 years of grad school, I definitely was missing kind of that undergraduate activism feeling and being involved. So my first 2 years, I definitely took on the role as the informant for other people. So all my presentations, every single paper I wrote about had to do with being undocumented. I was kind of looked to for that information, which I was happy to do because I know that the more people have exposure to it and have personal experiences, it could really change some people's minds about what it means to be undocumented. But it's also it takes an emotional toll to retell your story. And we are in the mental health field, so a lot of the cases that we read about or the clients that I have worked with throughout my time in grad school also share similar identities. And so it kind of gets exhausting you are undocumented, you study the subject, you present on the subject. So it's almost like you're re-traumatizing yourself every time. And at least for me, I've learned how to present on undocumented issues in a way that's professional and kind of distance myself from that. Other things I remember is my professor is really engaged with international psychology. And so in my lab, since we started, even with DACA, I've always been hesitant to travel abroad just because of the money. And I know my family would worry if I left and all these things. So my lab mates have been able to go to Peru and go to Mexico and present their research there. So that's something that I've always felt like I wasn't a part of. I didn't get to engage in that graduate school experience. Yeah, those are the big things that I just recall my first 2 years kind of struggling with, like trying to apply to different summer research programs, and they don't accept DACA, or even if they did, because it's federally funded, I would have to pay for everything. So even with the benefits of DACA, I'm still coming across barriers in many ways. But just like anyone else, I think you just try to find ways around it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You brought up a very important issue, right? And especially when we're talking about diversity and your own research as a scholar and as an activist too, right? In terms of the fact that the personal is political, right? I mean, and the fact that you are utilizing your lived experiences as that springboard for discussion in terms of a very, very important dialogue that needs to happen on the micro and on the macro level. But at the same time, this is incredibly challenging. It's very taxing, right? Because I mean, like you noted, it's not just research, right? It's part of like who you are. Especially considering the fact that this is like your area, right? Counseling and psychology, right? How do you still maintain that balance, right? And keep moving forward with the research, right? Even though there are obviously all these challenges on a daily level and on a long-term level, because they're not just numbers or just separate like testimonies, right? They're part of this larger community, right? Their voices, they're the voices of people who have to deal with these challenges on the daily. How do you navigate this?
I think that's something that I'm still working on. As you were talking, I just remember the night before the election, I actually was analyzing my interviews. I had interviewed people about growing up in mixed status families, and I had a research presentation that I had to do the week after. And I just remember that night trying to get through my interviews and also listening to the election. And at some point I was just like, I can't do this. Like, I'm trying to read, all these participants' stories, and then also like hearing about, Trump winning. It was just a surreal experience. And then having to present that the following week with everything that was going on. I definitely noticed that after the election, I had to take a step back, and I did. For up until recently, I kind of just stopped presenting on undocumented issues. I just needed a break from it all. And even though people knew me as that, I kind of made an effort. I'm like, you know what? I'm just going to choose to present or write on things that have nothing to do with this, because it was just very emotionally overwhelming for me. And in counseling, we always talk about how if you can't take care of yourself, how are you going to be able to help other people? So at least in the last year, that's kind of been my way of trying to balance my mental health needs and my education at the same time. Is just kind of taking a break from it all, which is impossible because this is my life, but at least I can engage in things that don't remind me of it every single time.
Yeah. I mean, definitely the current presidential administration has changed things exponentially. How do you think that the rhetoric coming out of the current presidential administration has helped to really shape the narrative linked to not just DACA students, but like the whole entire group of folks who are undocumented?
Yeah, it's very interesting. Like especially, with my parents and working in community centers that focus on mental health and reaching out a broader population, I recognize that I am very privileged, and that I think it was in 2007 when I started college, and that's when I first started hearing about like the dreamer narrative and, the deserving college student who's trying to make our society better. And I recognize that part of the motivation of me still being in school is because I've kind of encapsulated that narrative into myself. I'm like, okay, like school has been a safe haven for me for so long. And I've always found people who are willing to find loopholes and help me finish my education. And so I recognize that right now, even with DACA, even if we try to move away from the deserving college student, graduate student, immigrant, and even though we are trying to not, kind of move away from demonizing parents for their decisions, it's really hard. I think I appreciate the change in the narrative, and but also, yeah, I think it's really hard to move away from that, especially when oftentimes, especially with my parents, like they get upset when I talk about being undocumented, right? They grew up in a time where it's like, you don't talk about those things. But again, like we're in a position of privilege where we can kind of raise the voices of other communities, but sometimes we have to really watch out that we don't kind of fall prey to what the rhetoric is or politicians are using. And so
when did this moment, in terms of obviously, I mean, being in the echelons of the ivory tower is definitely a privileged position, but is that when just kind of the need to speak out on a larger, being the whole around being undocumented and unafraid, right? I'm thinking of that specific movement. So is that the space within the context of your undergraduate, even graduate education, where you felt more of a need to speak, which is obviously very, very important?
Yeah, I think in undergrad, so I found out that I was undocumented when I was around 17. So it took me kind of the 4 years of college to really grapple with that and figure out what that means for me. So I only ever hung out with other undocumented students at that point. So it was easy to talk about amongst ourselves. But it wasn't until I went and obtained a master's at another small private liberal arts college in LA. And it wasn't until there where I really started to speak up about what it meant to be undocumented and disclosed my status every time I presented in a classroom. And I think part of that is because I'm in the counseling field and you hear other people talking about, how do we help undocumented immigrants? And like, what does that mean? And all we do is read about it in textbooks. And so I kind of wanted to start bringing it to life for people who may not have, others in their lives that identified in that way. And so I kind of tried to keep that going in now that I'm in a PhD program. And I would like to say it's getting easier, but I think now with the administration and the rhetoric that's come around it, I've definitely noticed that I've started to backtrack, maybe I should be more careful of who I tell. Even with DACA, I'm like, I don't know. I feel like I have a new sense of fear that I didn't have a couple of years ago.
And you mentioned that a lot of powerful comments there in terms of realizing that you were undocumented at 17, which means, I think in a lot of ways, it sounds like you kind of grew up and you were kind of an old soul, kind of beyond your years, having to deal with these very real and challenging issues, right? And continuing to move forward. One of the things you did mention is that your circle of friends were also undocumented. So is that within the context of high school? But I think that within the context of college, that you already had that network of, or you were building that network of support?
Yeah. So my senior year, even when I was told I was undocumented, I still didn't know what that meant. I was like, okay, that's fine. It wasn't until I was in college and I started meeting people, and back then you would kind of say certain phrases to kind of indicate that you're undocumented, because it was still very much a taboo subject, I guess. So yeah, it wasn't until college where I was grappling with being undocumented, and I started disclosing to one person, and then finding out that person was also undocumented, and then realizing there was a whole community there. But yeah, in some senses, I did shelter myself. Like, I didn't have to, disclose to people who weren't undocumented. And those who were documented were like significant others or friends of other undocumented friends who were allies. So yeah, it's been, and I definitely did not have that in my master's program or now in my PhD program.
And how have you, I know you mentioned that your parents have been like, you don't speak of this, right? But then here you are being very vocal about this. How are kind of conversations navigated there? Because I would imagine that would be very difficult too.
Yeah, I just don't tell them. I mean, if I'm afraid, now with everything going on, and I know that I'm a little more secured, right, as a student, as a PhD student living in California, I can only imagine the amount of fear my parents might be having. So I think at first when I would tell them, oh, like I told so-and-so about my status, they just seemed so worried and would tell me stories of like, well, this happened to your cousin who did that, and they got deported. So I think after a while, I just try not to worry my parents, and I barely talk about the research that I do with them, because I think for them, it's just a whole different ballpark. Like for them, it's like, we came here in our, mid-20s, and we're working, and we've been undocumented, and we've been fine not telling people. And, my parents have been each other's support system. And then it's just different for me because I've grown up here, and my friends have also been undocumented, and they've been very vocal about it. So I don't know, just a different experience of what it means to be undocumented in California at their age, at my age. So yeah, I'm sure they would be like, like, why are you talking about this?
Well, actually, I'm really curious to ask in terms of like if you have siblings too, if you're like, older or younger or in the middle, like to seeing you bear witness to you going into your doctoral program. I mean, that must be also very powerful in the context of the family.
Yeah. I know for my parents, they were like, what are you doing? Like, I'm like, oh, I'm getting a doctorate. Not a doctor, not a medical doctor, doctorate. And so it's been a learning experience for them to know what it is I'm doing and while I'm still in school. And they have been supported nonetheless. I'm the oldest, and both my younger siblings were born here. My middle sister, I think, learned about my status when she was in high school, when I finally told her after kind of keeping it a secret for like 3 years after I learned that I was undocumented. And then I have a younger sister. So my middle sister is in her mid-20s now. And then my younger sister is just turning, I think, 15. So she's had a very different experience, just in terms of the fact that she's younger. My parents are more economically stable. So she's just had a very different experience from me and my other sister. And yeah, I think, I don't know what they think about me being in a PhD program. They tell me I'm a nerd, and they can't believe I'm still in school, but it's definitely opened their eyes to the possibility of, going beyond high school and college. I was the first to kind of finish high school, go to college, and now, get a master's and keep going to get a PhD. So I know there's this pressure that I'm sure affects them that they don't tell me, especially when my parents might make comments about, Anna had more barriers, or like, you should be doing just as good as her. But, you know, I think that's normal in any family. I think it just can add a little more when you and your siblings are of different statuses.
Yeah, definitely. You also mentioned that you, if you're comfortable addressing this too, that you kept it a secret from your sibling for 3 years.
Yeah, because my middle sister and I are about 4 to 5 years. We have a gap, and so I just remember thinking like, well, my parents said not to say anything, so I'm not going to say anything. And I don't know how that conversation came up, but one day I just told her. Maybe I think I was at a point where I was like comfortable enough to bring it up. Um, and I'm sure for her, she had no idea what I was talking about. But it's definitely been a source of tension between us. So I think that's another reason why we haven't spoken much about it. Um, she wasn't as academically driven as me in high school. And so my naive way of trying to push her to do better was, reminding her, like, you're a citizen, like, you should be doing better than me in school, like, I'm struggling more than you. So I think after a couple of years of kind of that type of conflict, we just had this unspoken agreement that we would just not bring it up. Like, why, bring up things that are just going to make us fight? She can't change her status. I'm not changing my status anytime soon. So it's definitely been different with her. With my younger sister, it's more of like educational, like, oh, like, just imagine all the things you can do when you get to college. And I feel like youth nowadays, especially youth of color, are exposed to more things, especially through social media. So me and her will have more conversations about a range of topics. So yeah, it's just been a interesting experience.
So you mentioned that your own lived experiences have informed your research. Can you talk a little bit about how?
Yeah. So when I was in college, I had to do like an honors thesis type of thing. And I remember wanting to do it on undocumented students. And back in 2010, 2011, there was barely any research kind of coming out about undocumented students. And then I went off and decided I wanted to do counseling. So I was like, oh, let me look at the counseling literature for this undocumented population. Very few. And so that kind of drove kind of my pathway towards a PhD program. Like, oh, like, I love doing counseling. I would love doing like family-based counseling. And one of the things that I thought about in my own family, I'm like, okay, well, this is a source of conflict, not only with my parents, but with my siblings. And, it's interesting, like, we're siblings, we have the same parents, we're growing up in similar ways, yet they, based on their status, will have much more privilege and access to resources than I am going to have. And so that kind of just sparked this idea, like, I wonder if other people experience this. Talking to my other friends who are undocumented, we would kind of joke around and talk about how frustrated we are with our younger siblings who aren't taking advantage of, their benefits. And so that kind of just drove me to like focus on that particular subject. Like, how do sibling relationships and family dynamics work in families where siblings are of different legal statuses? And how does that impact your relationship to them, your relationship to your parents, your family as a whole? Like, how do you navigate that? And also, I think partially it comes from the fact that me and my siblings don't talk about it openly. It just made me curious, like, well, I can kind of find out through other people's experiences. And it's been an interesting journey interviewing people and hearing their stories and being surprised when, maybe the undocumented sibling is like the last child or the middle child, or, just or like how it impacts when have a huge age gap between you, or you're closer in age. if you're a boy or a girl. Like it has been interesting, and it's definitely opened up my perspective about just how many different factors play a role in siblings.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It's actually really fascinating, right? In terms of your journey as a student, as a scholar, as a researcher, and your trajectory and where you are now, right? Especially in the context of really building off of and seeing how different family structures navigate through and just have a dialogue around being just legal status, right? Being documented or documented. So not to play devil's advocate though, but what would you say to folks who are not necessarily aware of or are even following kind of this counter narrative of what it means to be kind of undocumented, right? I mean, I'm referring specifically to folks who are saying like, oh, let's not renew DACA. It's a means of amnesty, right? Which it's not. What would you say to that audience?
Huh. I guess I've never thought of that. I mean, and this is really hard, right? Because I'm like, right, DACA is not a form of amnesty at all. But yeah, I think, yeah, I don't know what I would say. I don't think I've ever personally been confronted with that. Like, I hear about it through friends, I hear it in the news, but
okay, that's cool. So maybe I could ask you another question too, because what's really interesting in terms of today, I think is such a unique period of time in terms of our political climate for so many reasons. And there's definitely this big polarization or this divide in terms of who belongs and who doesn't belong, right? Who's the quote unquote other and who is the even quote unquote American, that that belongs, right? Which is still embedded in the context of belonging in graduate school, right? Because a lot of these spaces, when we think about higher education and we think of our numbers as underrepresented communities, right? Our numbers are still small, right? And definitely it's felt in the classroom, right? And I mean, you've already spoken about this in the context of just representation of other fellow DACA students, right? And especially in the context of graduate students, there's not that many. If you look across the UC system, it's difficult because the number is so small, right? So if you have kind of this divide, these rigid definitions of belonging and other, what do you think that this rhetoric says about how diversity is being defined on the federal level? But also let's take it back to the local level, because at the end of the day, we are in California, right? And the way diversity is being defined in the context of the UC system, right? Because the UC has had a very specific response in terms of the federal government. I don't know if you're aware, but the University of California system is headed by Janet Napolitano, who actually wrote the language with surrounding DACA. And so she brought on a lawsuit on behalf of the UC system against the federal government in terms of what is being done or opposing DACA being taken away. So what do you think this says about diversity on a federal level and on a local UC and even geographic level in terms of where you are?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. When I heard the announcement that, Jenna Napolitano, is suing on behalf of the UC system is suing and all that, I was like, oh, that's nice. I think partially I don't know. Like I said, I was in school before DACA, so I think I'm just so used to people, saying they're sorry and being like, oh, like I would love to help you, but, and so I think now is a time where I'm like, all right, like I'm tired of symbolic gestures, right? Like people saying they want to help, but are like, oh, my hands are tied and everything. So I'm really curious to see how schools will, especially those of us who are in school, how school systems are going to make an effort to actually help, the current undocumented undergrads and graduate students, right? Because we all have different needs at those two levels. I wish I could see more diversity, at the UC level of, not just legal status, but I also recognize that it's hard, right? I think, at least now that I'm like halfway through my graduate program, I'm like, anyone can do grad school. It's really psychologically hard and persistence, but anyone can do grad school. I truly believe that. But to get here is difficult, I think, right? There's so many things to consider. And being in California makes it a lot easier, right? Like, I've been to other states and I'm like, wow, like I cannot imagine what it would be like to be undocumented in a state where it's, much more anti-immigrant, restrictive in their laws. So I am grateful and privileged to be in California. But yeah, it would be, I think my experience might be different if there were more undocumented students, not only at the college level, like they're still, in comparison to other groups, not as much. And then as you get even higher up in academia, like it just gets less and less and less.
What advice would you give to, for example, undocumented undergraduate students who are considering graduate school, be it a master's program or a doctoral program?
Yeah, I think at least one of the things that I learned the hard way was finding people that you're willing to disclose to, whether it's at the master's level or the PhD level. In undergrad, because I had just learned I was undocumented, I really didn't disclose my status to like my university, and I missed out on so many opportunities to engage in like programs with other undocumented students, like scholarships. Like I was just barely learning what was out there. And so I kind of made it a point that, in graduate school, I'm going to make it a priority to seek out services that I know I deserve, right? Like, and I think that's hard, right? Like you have to put it in your mind, like I have a right to an education, and I should have a right to access resources that any other person has access to. And belonging, like, people always talk about imposter syndrome in grad school, and it's even twice as hard when you don't have legal status, where you literally cannot participate in certain things because of your status. And you can't help but compare yourself to other grad students and what they've been able to achieve. And really it's just reminding yourself like, well, I got here with all these other barriers. I definitely belong here. So I think that's one of those things that like, and it's hard. It's really hard when you read a newspaper or you're on social media or you're hearing the news where it's just the same thing being said. It's like the same story being played over again and again and again of who's deserving and who's not. And you have to be a student, to deserve anything. And I think that's part of it. It's hard when you're in academia, when you're not around other people who aren't, who don't fit the, documented student, or, who are just the people who like are cleaning the university, who might also be undocumented, right? Like trying to hold on to that connection to remind yourself that like your education, yes, gives you a lot of benefits and privileges, but that doesn't make you better or more deserving than someone who is undocumented and not in school. So I think that helps ground me in a lot of ways in the work that I do, and helps me push through like, okay, I am privileged. I am in this white ivory tower, then let me do something about it to help others who maybe didn't have the same opportunity.
It's very powerful, Angie. Very, very well said. Very well said. Do you have any closing thoughts? I think you pretty much definitely pointed towards the great closing thoughts, but would you like to share anything else?
I guess the only thing I can think of, and I think it's been something that I've seen a lot in other friends right now who are doing a lot of activism work, is like finding time to take care of yourself. And it's okay to, you know, spend a day where you don't have to look at social media or be up to date on everything all the time, because it is emotionally draining. And as someone who's like, in the last couple months, I'm like, oh, my anxiety is off the roof, and I'm trying to, you know, not fall into the pits of depression with everything that's going on. Like, just trying to find the little things in life that, you know, keep you positive and push you forward is really important, especially when we live it, we research it, and we do it every day.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you so much for being part of the program today, Angie. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you.
So I'm going to go ahead and sign off.